Welcome to this episode of CEO Perspectives, a signature series by the Conference Board. CEO Perspectives are conversations that take an objective, nonpartisan look at a range of subjects that matter most to business leaders. I'm Steve Odland, the CEO of the Conference Board and the host of this series. And in today's conversation, we're going to talk about succession planning. Why is it important to create this talent pipeline? What should a good plan include, and how can you best prepare leaders to succeed those ahead of them?
You are listening to CEO Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.
Joining me today is Cheryl Stokes, the CEO of CNEXT, an organization that helps to develop and advance high-impact leaders. Cheryl, welcome.
Thank you so much.
So Cheryl, you've had an awesome career. Can you just tell our listeners a little bit about your background and what you've done in your career?
Well, thank you, Steve. Well, my roots are in engineering. I'm from Flint, Michigan, the birthplace of General Motors. So, of course, I went to General Motors Institute and worked at GM early in my career. I worked in the aluminum industry as a metallurgy and process engineer. And it was there that I got more interested in people and the challenges that underlay some of the technical issues that I was experiencing. And so went to graduate school. Had the privilege of being at MIT in a program called Leaders for Manufacturing at the time. It's now Leaders for Global Operations. But it was when there was the Organizational Learning Center there, and that was my passion, learning. And so I focused on learning, culture, and change. That led me to the Coca-Cola Company as an internal consultant around learning, culture, change, and leadership. And coincidentally, there I met Jack Stahl, who is one of the co-founders of CNEXT. He was the global president of Coca-Cola at the time, but was privileged to work with the company and many of the bottlers around the world. Left in 2000 to move to North Carolina and help Duke University start a business, Duke Corporate Education. So helped found and run that business for 18 years, working with clients globally, variety of roles, leading the business in Europe, et cetera. Came back from Duke in 2018 from Europe and joined Heidrick & Struggles as a partner in the consulting side of that business, focused on leadership, DEI, culture shaping, and I had the opportunity to do work around succession planning, particularly CEO succession, in partnership with many of the search colleagues there. And I have been very privileged to be at CNEXT for now a little bit over a year as CEO. And for me, it really brings together those themes of my career: leadership, culture, DEI. And so delighted to talk with you about succession planning and the connection to development.
Yeah, listening to your background is very instructive, and it's interesting that you started out as an engineering in the business. You didn't start out as an HR person in recruiting and so forth, like so many do, but you really got a grounding in the business. You might want to share how that grounding and understanding of the way the business works helped to guide you, in later in your career and obviously in leadership.
Yeah, it's a great point, Steve. I very much value the business grounding that I got, and I think as CNEXT, we work to develop enterprise leaders. I have a view that enterprise leaders really do understand the business, how the business makes money, how the parts are connected. That always was my own curiosity. And I think it helped me in my consulting stages to really have that sort of that engineering curiosity and that intellectual curiosity about the challenges that businesses were facing, even as it relates to people or technology or whatever the challenge might be.
Yeah, so describe what you do at CNEXT. Now, you've been there for, as CEO, you're working to develop leaders. How does all that work?
Yeah, so CNEXT is a leadership and executive networking and development business. We work with Fortune 1000 companies to help them build a more robust, prepared, and diverse pipeline of leaders. Our leadership programs are really unique. They're led by current and former Fortune-ranked CEOs, by various subject matter experts, and best-in-class companies themselves teach in our programs. And what they're doing is providing actionable frameworks for our leaders and our members to transform what they're hearing from the CEOs or the subject matter experts into new future-proof solutions that really help them accomplish their goals in business and grow as leaders.
Yeah, so we're talking about succession planning, and we've got to start with saying, what the heck is a succession plan?
Yeah, it's a great question. So a succession plan really is a process and a plan. It's a tool to ensure that there's a continuity of leadership, that organizations have the pipeline of leaders and capability that they need to execute their strategy and position for the future. And really, the goal of succession planning isn't about a transfer of power necessarily for leaders, having the next CEO or the next CXO, but it really is about having a robust, inclusive pipeline of ready talent so that when it's time for a transfer of power, so to speak, it's not an issue because you've got the capability that you need ready and teed up to move into role.
Yeah, and this is increasingly important in a knowledge-based economy and knowledge-based companies where human beings are the assets of an organization, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, I would go so far as to say when organizations don't have thoughtful succession planning and when they're not attentive, they're actually putting the future of their organization at risk. If you're dependent on current leaders and current leaders only, and you haven't thought about what happens if they're not available or the next person in line isn't available, then you're opening the door to potentially not continuing the company, potentially not um, taking advantage of the future opportunities that are there for the business.
Yeah, and we operate in a multi-stakeholder world with customers, employees, owners, and community, and so you risk running a disconnect with all of those multiple stakeholders.
Absolutely, absolutely. And good succession planning considers those multiple stakeholders, which is why, I use the words a robust and inclusive pipeline, because I very much believe in the power of diversity and inclusion in order to get great business results, great decisions. And when you have a succession plan that reflects the communities where your constituents are, that reflects the talent base available and the customer base, then you are more likely to have great candidates who are in tune with the needs and the opportunities of the business.
Now you work with Heidrick, and they're a world-class search firm. You worked on the consulting side of that, but what do you say to people when they say, "Well, I don't need a succession plan because I just hire a search firm and we'll find somebody from the outside"?
Yeah, and no disrespect at all to the Heidricks and Korn Ferries of the world, because there's a very important role for executive search and for external talent. But if all you ever do is hire externally to meet critical roles, you send a message to your current organization that there's no path for them. You do a disservice to the talent that's there without giving them the opportunity to develop. And they've invested their lives and time in the business, and they may be the right successor with some coaching, mentoring, and development to prepare them for that next role.
Yeah, and in my career, I've learned that you always look at the people around you and you go, well, that person's not perfect, that person's not perfect. And by the way, if you look in the mirror, that person's not perfect. But from the outside, everybody looks wonderful. They look perfect. And so therefore we should go outside. Well, the fact of the matter is those people are not perfect either. And so sometimes, you're better off, going with the people that got you there.
Sometimes that's absolutely true. Although I'm of the opinion that for those more senior roles, it is great to have both external and internal candidates because you get a view of the market, you get a view of what talent may be available, and you're giving the opportunity for people who've grown and know your business. But what's key is having objective assessment that allows you against a profile of what the role may be. Let's go with C-suite. It's a CXO position. You need to have a picture of what that role is. What are the requirements for current state and for the future, where that role needs to take you? And then you should be able to assess those candidates, both externally and internally, against their capability to perform the role. And there are going to be gaps in whoever you meet, right? No one will be perfect, to your point earlier. And with an external person, a lot of it is unknown. So you'll have to do reference checking. You'll have to get as much data as you can to understand really the track record and capability that they have. For your internal people, even if they aren't the candidate that's ultimately selected, when you assess them, it is a great opportunity to give them a development plan that helps them address some of the gaps that may have been uncovered so they can be just better leaders, period, and a viable candidate for succession.
Yeah, and realistically, there needs to be a balance because you want some people coming from the outside for new and fresh thinking and so forth. But it's you have to think about corporate culture or company or organizational culture and how to maintain that. And so the succession from within is a piece of that too, isn't it?
Absolutely. And, when I talk about assessing the candidate, I think best in class organizations also assess the culture and the team that the candidate will come into, because that gives you a view of what's there now. If this person coming in is extraordinarily different, maybe you need that if your desire is to transform or to shake things up, or if you've got too much groupthink, if you will, there's too much homogeneity versus if it's someone internal, they may sort of be stuck and we do things the way we do things, right? So you have to have a view of the team that the candidate would be leading, their culture and the profiles of those individuals, so you understand what the potential candidate brings to the party that will be different, that will push and challenge them, and where there might be potential conflicts that you'll have to help them navigate.
So, describe generally what a model succession plan should include.
Yeah, so a model succession plan definitely starts with a clear understanding of the organization's strategy and future needs. So you've got to ground it in the business, understand the role. So again, since it's one that many people will be familiar with, if you're talking about CEO succession, what is it that you need the CEO of the future to do? And it's got to be beyond the current job today, if you will. So getting clarity with the board on that role description, getting buy-in from the executive team on that role description and the capabilities required that are essential and which ones are sort of nice to have. So you've got that profile that you're looking for. And then once, again, you have that, you have to have a way to assess against the profile. If you're working with a firm like a Heidrick or a Korn Ferry, et cetera, they've got tools that do that kind of assessment. Some organizations manage this process internally, and so they may have an internal 360 that they can, or an internal assessment diagnostic that they can use to assess against the profile. But you've got to have data that grounds you in what's required, what the candidate will need to do, where there would be gaps. And then you've got to have the plan for any individual under consideration, what they would need to do to close the gaps. Because to the point we've made earlier, no one will be perfect. So you'll have to decide, where do we have the strongest candidates that bring, something unique, that brings something that's missing now? What else will we need to do? So you've got the role, you've got the assessment, you've got the plan, and then finally, best in class organizations, they aren't just looking for one or two people, they've got a pool of potential successors. And so having a view of that pool, where they are, what experiences do they need? Maybe it's just a matter of they haven't run this part of the organization or they haven't worked in it enough. So maybe it means an assignment in another part of the organization. Maybe there's external education that they need. So they, go to a program at one of the business schools, or maybe there's internal development that they need, or maybe they come to a program like CNEXT where we do that kind of development, right? So you have to have all of those things in place and an indication of the time that you would expect a person to be ready by in order to move into the next role. So, there's a lot of pieces there in what I've said, but, key is this is also a living document. It's not something that you just do once and then you put it on the shelf, but, people continue to evolve and grow and they have new experiences. And so you've got to note that and incorporate it into your plans, because maybe it moves your internal people higher up in the pool, or maybe there's an external person that you considered, a couple years back that, now their skill set seems even more relevant. And so you might want to reconsider them if they are still interested. So it's a living document that evolves to meet the company's needs.
We're talking succession planning with Cheryl Stokes. We're going to take a short break and we'll be right back.
What does the future of work mean for your employees? How will your company navigate ESG? Will there be a global recession? At the Conference Board, our experts translate the latest research and economic analysis into insights and real-time problem solving for your organization. Membership at the Conference Board provides your team with an assortment of knowledge from economics, marketing and communications, ESG, public policy, and human capital. As a member, you'll have access to our center experts, member-exclusive events, data and benchmarking tools, and peer sharing that will help you understand the present and shape the future. Consider becoming a Conference Board member today by visiting www.conference-board.org.
Welcome back to CEO Perspectives. I'm your host, Steve Odland from the Conference Board, and I'm joined today by Cheryl Stokes, the CEO of CNEXT. So Cheryl, we were talking about, what a model succession plan looks like. Maybe you could share with us an example or two that might be familiar to our audience on a succession plan that was well executed.
Yeah, so there are a couple notable ones in the tech field that most people would be familiar with. So Apple, Steve Jobs, everyone knows the amazing work that he did with Apple, but he brought Tim Cook along. Tim was Apple's COO. He was being groomed for that role for several years before Steve's passing. And so Apple was planning and had Steve and Tim working together long enough where Tim could absorb the things and be mentored by Steve, etc. Still in tech, the CEO of Microsoft, Satya Nadella, where he was identified as a successor to Steve Ballmer early on, and he was given different roles of increasing responsibility around the business until he was ready to take over. And so, that's an instance where, I think his unique cultural perspective also helped reinvigorate Microsoft's strategy and their culture as an organization. So those are two that I think most people would be familiar with.
Yeah, and I one was sort of more of an emergency situation, with Apple. The other one was more deliberate. But it goes back to what you were saying before the break, which is you have to start with what are the needs of the organization, and what's the future plan that the organization has, and then what does it take in a leader, and it may be something completely different than the leader who's the incumbent in the role, but somebody different to take them to the next level. So that in each of these cases, I think you've described that. And the other thing is you pointed out that that these successors have experiences in multiple places, at least in the organization, and you may want to just build on how important that is, because it used to be, in business or in an organization, you started up in one vertical and one column, and you got to the top, and that was it. But that really didn't prepare people as well for these leadership roles, did it?
No, I totally agree. And absolutely, that's not the way that it would happen today. But I know what you mean. It used to be you came up through finance and you ran the business, right? Or you came up through sales. And while those experiences are highly relevant, it's important to understand the other functions of the business. And whether that happens with an internal candidate, internal to the business, or whether it's an external person who has had a variety of roles in different industries, that breadth of experience is extremely critical for senior leaders to have the sort of foresight to understand, what's happening in the market. What are the trends that might be impacting the business and that present new opportunities for the business. And if you've grown up in just one stovepipe, if you will, it can be difficult to connect to those trends and understand the environment. And also the varied experiences across functions and parts of the organization help you understand how to lead and connect with those parts of the organization once you have responsibility for it all. I mean, how many times have you heard of a leader who, if they grew up in finance, they can't keep their hands out of the finance parts. They want to keep kind of doing the job. Whereas when people level up to these senior roles and C-suite positions, they really do have to have the strategic oversight of the business and not be that, hands-on technical person, or else they risk alienating their leaders and underperforming and many other not so great consequences.
Well, they wouldn't be doing their jobs, which is, leadership of a broad, in a broader context. So, Cheryl, I have to ask you. So, you've talked about all the components of a succession plan, and you've given some examples. Whose accountability is it for succession planning?
Yeah, succession planning really involves a range of stakeholders, but it's a shared responsibility of the executive team. Typically, the CEO and the board are at the helm of senior succession planning. And then, as we know, HR plays a significant role as an enabler, implementing the strategies to get, an array of talent with the right backgrounds to manage the assessment process. And typically a CHRO will be running that process for the executive team in partnership with whatever external resources he or she may connect with. But the key is that it's collaborative in that identification of the needs and the pool of talent. And then the other steps are the things that we talked about.
I've heard people say, when asked, do you do succession planning? Oh, yes, we have a lot of leadership development. Are leadership development and succession planning the same thing, or are they different?
No, they're different but related. As I mentioned earlier, succession planning is a process that relies on leadership development, but it's the process by which you identify the pipeline or pool of leaders to replace other leaders as they leave or as they retire or as things happen. And so succession planning, there's a plan that comes out of it, right? Whereas leadership development is an ongoing process of preparing a broad spectrum of leaders for the organization. It may not be necessarily everyone involved in a leadership development program is on your succession plan. It just may be about helping leaders be better leaders today for the job that they are, helping equip them with new capabilities, not necessarily putting them on the succession plan for leading a department or a function or a division or a business.
Right. So basically, a succession plan is the roadmap for the position, but leadership development is the process by which you develop the individual, right? And important in all of that is mentorship, and you've been, really an advocate for mentorship. Talk about how that process works.
Yeah, mentorship is incredibly important as it helps equip leaders, new leaders, leaders in role, to have guidance and support from others in the business who can be a sounding board, who can share their own experience, who can help make connections. And, side point, people talk about mentorship and sponsorship. They are different. Sponsorship is typically where there's a more senior person who's putting sort of their seal of approval and credibility behind a more junior person to give them opportunities. So you're advocating for this person to move into a role, versus mentoring is that almost coaching relationship that you have with another person who can help, be a sounding board and help give you input to strategic decisions, et cetera.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned, DEI earlier, and, a lot of companies have developed DEI groups, leaders in and of themselves. And then there's a DEI process within a company, but sometimes people kind of put that and say, okay, that's over there. And then leadership and succession is over here. And what I heard you say is that, no, they're all interrelated. Talk about that.
Absolutely. So DEI, and I would add B to it for belonging, is a critical strategic business initiative. You have to ground whatever you're doing around DEI in the strategy of the business in the same way that you ground your succession plans. So they're related in that way. And similar to a succession plan, the executive team has accountability and ownership. And it's, not because it's corporate altruism where you're trying to, right wrongs in society, but it is because so much research has shown and so many examples for decades of organizations outperforming their competitors in the marketplace when you have a more diverse and inclusive set of talent. And it just makes sense. You're getting differing perspectives, different experiences, different backgrounds. And so you're connecting with your stakeholders, your community, the talent in ways that if you are too homogenous, you don't have that benefit. So DEI is linked and a critical part of the strategy of the business. So in the same way that HR is an enabler and implements the succession planning, HR typically is an enabler and implements the DEIB work for organizations. However, I'm a firm believer that the accountability of it rests with the executive team and that connection that they're making to, why is this even important for us as a business? What benefit does it help us get, and how do we connect to our consumers and the talent and our key stakeholders, the communities where we operate in a way that generates value for all of us? So,
Yeah, so it's not a separate thing that you do. It's all part of this whole process, and I think that, that's really important for people and leadership to understand.
Yeah, absolutely. And just as with any other strategic business initiative, you prioritize it, you resource it properly, and you set targets and you measure the outcomes.
Exactly. You mentioned some things that you thought were important for leadership development and hence succession. Some of those were to make sure you had the right people, the right cultural fit, and some cross-functional moves. Any other thoughts on what can help develop the best leaders in a succession plan?
Yeah, so it definitely varies, but best practices number one would be to be intentional. So don't have it be an emergency situation, but you're actually intentionally planning the development of that talent. You're planning development for your organization. Again, it's grounded in the strategy. It is I would say broad reaching. So definitely consider your internal candidates, but also look externally to understand, what's best in the marketplace and how might you develop that capability in-house if you don't have it, or bring it in-house if you don't have it. Those are all things to consider. And, where leadership development is happening more broadly, one of the tenets that we have at CNEXT is there's a lot that you can learn outside of your industry. And so we do a lot of cross-industry, cross-company learning. And there's an argument certainly that there are things to learn in your industry that are very specific. But when you get to scanning the environment, understanding trends that are happening that could impact your business, and then having enough foresight to know how to react and to be agile and adapt and create new solutions that work for your clients and your company, it's easier to do that when you're being exposed to a broad array of leaders and people from other organizations. And so there's a place for learning outside of your industry that stretches that muscle of, the word I keep using is foresight, which we know is critically important for leaders.
Cheryl Stokes, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Stephen. It's been a pleasure. Appreciate the opportunity, and I'm happy to talk with you about succession planning and leadership development.
And thanks to all of you for listening into CEO Perspectives. Every week, I'll be joined by a prominent thought leader to provide insights on the issues of our time. We'll cover the leading topics in human capital, geopolitics, economics, and more. Please share CEO Perspectives with your colleagues, with your friends, with all of your potential successors. I'm Steve Odland, and this series has been brought to you by the Conference Board.
You have been listening to CEO Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.